Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to imagine, just for a second, a reality that feels, well, almost alien to our modern sensibilities.
Right.
But it was actually the defining condition of life for our recent ancestors. I mean, we're not talking about some sudden, terrifying outbreak that commands the headlines for a few months and then just vanishes.
Right, not like a sudden pandemic.
Exactly. We are talking about the background noise of everyday existence. Just a quiet, persistent catastrophe sitting in the corner of virtually every living room in the 19th century.
Yeah, the scale is just, it's hard to grasp.
It really is. At its absolute peak, this singular disease was responsible for roughly 1 out of every 7 deaths on the planet. 1 in 7.
Which is just staggering.
Right. It is the undisputed deadliest killer of the 1800s. And today, we are diving deep into the historical dossier of tuberculosis.
Yeah, it's a staggering mortality rate. And, what makes it so insidious is really the pacing of it. Yeah, because when we analyze 19th century history, our modern minds instinctively gravitate toward those explosive epidemics, right? We picture cholera ravaging London or yellow fever completely shutting down ports in Philadelphia or New Orleans.
Oh, for sure. The fast-moving stuff.
Exactly. Those were terrifying, but they're episodic. I mean, they devastated a population and then they receded. But tuberculosis, which was historically known as consumption or the White Plague, that was a constant, unrelenting presence. It was just woven directly into the demographic fabric of society.
And the stack of sources we are synthesizing for you today really reflects that ubiquity. I mean, we aren't just looking at dry medical textbooks here.
No, not at all.
We are parsing through a massive historical dossier for this deep dive. We've got public domain memoirs from patients who documented their daily lives. We have the architectural blueprints of early sanatoriums.
The legislative history of municipal housing reforms, too.
Yes. And the actual raw laboratory notes from the 1940s that finally documented a biochemical breakthrough. So our mission today is to explore a phenomenon that goes far beyond just medicine.
Right, because it was a whole societal shift.
Exactly. We are looking at how an entire society, not just a handful of isolated doctors, and certainly not the federal government, how a whole culture had to physically, socially, and architecturally mobilize to fight a pathogen.
Because for 60 agonizing years, humanity possessed the exact biological identity of this killer, but they had absolutely no weapon to destroy it.
None at all.
And that 60-year medical void is really the crucible of our story today. During that gap, society had to rely on, extreme environmental manipulation.
Which sounds kind of intense.
Oh, it was. We were talking about forcing patients into freezing mountain air, reshaping the actual architecture of major cities to improve airflow, and funding these massive public health initiatives through the sale of, essentially, penny charity stamps.
Literally a penny at a time.
Right. It required sheer, stubborn human endurance to hold the line until a cure could literally be extracted from a clump of dirt in 1943.
Which is wild.
It is. But to comprehend the scale of this mobilization, we kind of have to establish the baseline first. We have to look at how the White Plague actually operated inside the human body and how that specific biology dictated the social response.
Okay, let's get into the biology then, because tuberculosis is a slow, wasting disease, right? And that created a really profound duality in how the culture perceived it.
What's fascinating here is that duality you mentioned, because it wasn't a sudden infection that killed in days. Consumption could take months or, even decades to run its course.
Yeah, I was reading through the literary and social critiques in our sources, and there's this bizarre, almost grotesque aestheticization of the disease among the 19th century upper classes. They actually romanticized it.
It really did. It is a fascinating psychological defense mechanism by a society that, frankly, couldn't stop a pathogen.
Right. If you can't cure it, rebrand it.
Exactly. Because they couldn't cure it, the wealthy elite reframed it entirely. The physical manifestation of tuberculosis actually aligned disturbingly well with Victorian beauty standards.
Okay, walk me through the physiological mechanism behind those symptoms.
Sure. So the bacteria, which is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, usually colonizes the lungs. The human immune system responds by trying to wall off that infection, right? It creates these little nodules called tubercles.
Hence the name tuberculosis.
Exactly. But the bacteria are incredibly resilient. So as the immune system fights this chronic protracted war, the body constantly releases inflammatory cytokines.
Okay.
Specifically one called tumor necrosis factor, or TNF.
And TNF is what drives that physical wasting we read about.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Historically, TNF was actually called cachexin because it induces something called cachexia.
Cachexia.
Yeah, it's a severe systemic weight loss and muscle atrophy. The body's metabolism is essentially hijacked to fight the infection. So it's suppressing the appetite while simultaneously burning through fat and muscle stores. This is exactly why it was called consumption. The disease literally appeared to consume the patient from the inside out.
Which resulted in the patient becoming just incredibly thin and frail. And, because the upper classes in the Victorian era equated physical frailty with wealth meaning, like you didn't have to perform manual outdoor labor, this horrific biological wasting was suddenly seen as a marker of refinement.
It's so twisted.
It really is. You see this all over the literature of the time. Lord Byron famously said he actually wished to die of consumption because the ladies would all say, "Look at poor Byron, how interesting he looks in dying."
Yeah, I mean, it is deeply unsettling when you strip away the poetry and realize they were just admiring the late stages of organ failure.
Totally. They were admiring the cachexia, the extreme pallor caused by anemia, and the dilated bright eyes that accompanied that chronic low-grade fever.
Right, it became intertwined with this whole idea of the tragic artist, the doomed poet whose spirit was simply too refined, too brilliant for their frail physical vessel to contain. You see it in the Bronte sisters and Chopin.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a modern parallel to this because it seems so alien to us today. And the closest analogy I can draw isn't exactly medical, but social.
Oh, like what?
It's similar to how the fashion industry in the 1990s heavily promoted heroin chic.
Oh, yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. They took the physical manifestations of severe drug addiction and malnutrition, hollow cheekbones, dark circles, extreme thinness, and just completely divorced them from the grim reality of the addiction itself. They rebranded it as high-end, edgy fashion.
The aesthetic was completely detached from the pathology.
Exactly. But just like that modern phenomenon, the romanticization of the White Plague just evaporates the second you look outside those upper-class drawing rooms.
That is a highly accurate comparison. I mean, the aestheticization of TB was an extreme luxury. For the vast majority of the population, the urban poor, the millions of immigrants flooding into the rapidly industrializing cities of Europe and North America, there was absolutely nothing poetic about it.
Coughing up blood in a dark, unventilated room is not very romantic.
No, not at all. For the working class, consumption was just an engine of pure economic and social devastation.
The tenement reports from cities like New York and London in our dossier are frankly brutal to read. This is where we see the actual mechanics of transmission at work.
Right, because tuberculosis is an airborne disease. It's transmitted through aerosolized droplets when an infected person coughs, speaks, or sneezes.
And in the late 19th century, you had tenement architecture designed purely for maximum occupancy and minimum cost. You had these things called dumbbell tenements.
Ah, those are awful.
Yeah, where entire families lived in interior rooms with literally zero access to natural light or fresh air.
Which is basically the perfect incubator for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The bacteria can survive in the air, but it's actually highly susceptible to ultraviolet light. Direct sunlight kills it quite effectively.
Okay, so a windowless room is a nightmare.
Exactly. In a windowless tenement room shared by 8 people, a single cough suspends the bacteria in that stagnant air. And it can linger there for hours, just waiting to be inhaled by a child, a spouse, or a neighbor. It was absolutely a disease of density.
And the economic death spiral that followed is documented in just agonizing detail in the records of these early charity workers. If the primary wage earner of a family contracted consumption, it wasn't a quick death that allowed the family to mourn and try to rebuild.
No, it was a grinding, multi-year decline.
Right. The breadwinner slowly loses the physical capacity to work. The family's meager savings are completely drained. Then, because they are trapped in that unventilated room, the mother gets sick.
Then the eldest child.
Exactly. It completely hollowed out families, leaving literally thousands of orphans to the state.
Furthermore, the social stigma attached to the disease in the working classes was severe. While the wealthy might have seen it as a sign of spiritual sensitivity, the prevailing societal view often associated it with squalor, dirt, and moral failing.
Really? Moral failing.
Yeah, because the prevailing pre-germ theory medical establishment heavily blamed miasmas.
Right, the bad air theory.
Exactly. Bad air emanating from rotting organic matter, or they blamed inherent constitutional weakness. If you contracted TB, society often viewed it as a reflection of your character or your living conditions.
Wow, talk about victim blaming.
It was intense. Consequently, families would actively hide the illness. They'd refuse to seek help until the very end, which of course only ensured the pathogen continued to spread unchecked through the entire neighborhood.
So the desperation for an answer, for some definitive explanation of what was tearing society apart, had to have reached a critical mass by the late 1800s. People needed to see the enemy.
They absolutely did.
And that historical pivot happens on March 24th, 1882. This is the moment a German bacteriologist named Robert Koch steps up to a podium at the Physiological Society in Berlin and fundamentally shifts human understanding forever.
Koch's presentation is a cornerstone moment in the history of medicine. He doesn't just theorize, He provides absolute reproducible proof that tuberculosis is caused by a singular, specific, microscopic organism.
He identifies the tubercle bacillus.
Yes, exactly.
We really have to emphasize the sheer technical difficulty of what Koch achieved here, because he wasn't just looking through a microscope at a drop of blood and saying, there it is.
Oh, no. Not even close.
Identifying this specific bacteria was notoriously difficult because of its unique biological armor.
Right. The cell wall of Mycobacterium tuberculosis is heavily fortified with mycolic acids, which are these thick, waxy lipids.
So it's basically covered in wax.
Basically, yeah. And standard medical dyes and stains of the era simply washed right off it. You couldn't see the bacteria because you couldn't stain it. It was practically invisible.
So what did Koch do?
He spent months developing a completely novel technique. He discovered that if he used a specific alkaline methylene blue stain and, crucially, applied heat to physically melt the waxy cell wall.
Wait, he melted the cell wall.
Just enough to let the dye penetrate, yes. And then he applied a brown counterstain. When he did that, the tubercle bacilli would suddenly appear as these brilliant, glowing blue rods against a brown background.
He essentially had to invent the flashlight before he could find the killer in the dark.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. But Koch went further than just staining it. He established what we now call Koch's postulates.
Which are still taught today, right?
They are. It's a rigorous four-step scientific criteria to definitively link a specific microbe to a specific disease. First, the organism must be present in every single case of the disease.
Makes sense.
Second, you must be able to isolate the organism from a diseased host and grow it in pure culture in a lab.
Okay.
Third, when you introduce that cultured organism into a healthy, susceptible host, in his case, he used guinea pigs, it must cause the exact same disease.
Wow.
And finally, fourth, you must be able to re-isolate the organism from that newly infected host.
So he locked the science down perfectly. He isolated it, grew it, infected animals with it, and isolated it again. There was no more debating about miasmas or bad humors or constitutional weakness.
None. The white plague was a bug. It had a biological identity.
It was a massive triumph of the scientific method. The news of Koch's discovery was telegraphed around the world instantly. I mean, it was front-page news globally.
Yeah.
Humanity finally knew exactly what was killing 1 in 7 people.
They did.
So what does this all mean? This leads us to what is perhaps the most frustrating, agonizing historical irony we've ever covered in a deep dive. Koch gives the world this perfect clarity. But what did that actually mean for the patient coughing up blood in a tenement in 1883?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. Knowing the biological identity of the pathogen did not magically conjure a weapon to fight it.
The analogy that constantly comes to mind is a city being terrorized by an elusive serial killer.
Yeah.
The police finally get a break. They manage to snap a crystal clear, high-definition mugshot of the killer.
Right.
They figure out his name, his address, and exactly how he picks the locks on his victims' doors. The police chief holds a massive press conference, holds up the mugshot and says, "We finally know exactly who is doing this." The city cheers.
Of course they do.
But then the chief leans into the microphone and adds, "Unfortunately, we have absolutely no weapons that can pierce his armor. Our jail cells cannot hold him, and we have no police force capable of arresting him. So maybe try to sleep with your windows open."
Yeah, it is a grim analogy, but clinically very accurate. Koch delivered the mugshot, but he did not deliver a cure. For the next 60 years, doctors operated in a terrifying medical void.
60 years.
Yeah. They could diagnose you with unprecedented accuracy by looking at your sputum under a microscope, but they could offer you zero pharmaceutical intervention. There were no antibiotics, there was no pill, no injection, no serum that could kill the tubercle bacillus inside a living human without also killing the human.
60 years. That is multiple generations of human beings living, suffering, and dying while knowing the exact face of their killer, yet remaining entirely powerless to stop it. It's an unbearable tension.
It really is.
So society had to adapt. If medical science couldn't synthesize a weapon to kill the bacteria, they had to figure out a way to alter the environment so the human body could fight it to a standstill.
Which necessitates a radical shift in treatment philosophy. If you cannot rely on pharmacology, you must rely on physiology and environment. And this forces the creation of the sanatorium movement.
Right.
And the central figure in the American iteration of this movement is a man named Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau.
Trudeau's story is critical here, primarily because he wasn't approaching this strictly from the detached perspective of medical academic. He was a patient himself.
Yes, he was.
In his early 20s, Trudeau watched his own older brother die of consumption. And shortly after finishing his own medical training, Trudeau himself was diagnosed with the disease. In the 1870s, receiving that diagnosis was essentially a death sentence.
Pretty much. The prevailing medical advice at the time, well, if a patient had the financial means, was to change climates. Go somewhere warm, like the American Southwest or the French Riviera, and basically wait to die.
But Trudeau took a different path.
He did. He had a deep love for the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. It was a place where he had hunted and fished in his youth. Believing he had very little time left, he essentially went to the freezing, isolated wilderness of the Adirondacks to die in a place that brought him peace.
But the twist is, he didn't die.
No, he didn't.
He spent the winter in a hunting lodge, exposed to the bitter sub-zero cold, resting constantly, eating whatever he could keep down. And remarkably, his symptoms began to recede. His fever broke, he gained weight, and his vitality returned.
Trudeau experienced a spontaneous remission, which we now know can happen with tuberculosis depending on the individual's immune response. But Trudeau attributed his survival directly to the specific environmental conditions of the Adirondacks.
The climate itself.
Right, the altitude, the pristine pine-scented air, and the extreme cold. He decided to formalize his personal experience into a rigorous medical protocol. In the winter of 1884 to 1885, he purchased a small plot of land at Saranac Lake.
And he built a small two-bed cottage.
Yep, and opened the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium.
This single cottage becomes the blueprint for a massive nationwide movement. Saranac Lake eventually transforms from a tiny logging outpost into a booming, internationally renowned cure town dedicated entirely to the treatment of tuberculosis.
It really became an industry.
And the regimen Trudeau developed was incredibly strict. It rested on 4 non-negotiable pillars: continuous exposure to fresh, cold air, absolute complete rest, a highly caloric diet, and only when the patient showed significant improvement, very strictly regulated, graduated physical activity.
And we must deeply examine the human experience of this regimen because, frankly, it was grueling. The architecture of the sanatorium was built entirely around these pillars.
Right, the buildings themselves were treatments.
Exactly. The most iconic feature of any sanatorium was the cure porch. These were massive, deep, open-air galleries attached to the patient rooms. The prevailing medical theory held that the cold, dense air acted almost as a physiological stimulant. It would, they thought, flush the diseased lungs and suppress the fever.
I was reading the memoirs included in our dossier from patients who actually spent years at Saranac Lake.
Yeah.
The phrase they all used was, chasing the cure.
Chasing the cure, yes.
It's such a poignant, exhausting phrase. It implies this endless, desperate pursuit of health that is always just one more month, one more winter away. The daily reality of chasing the cure on these porches is genuinely hard to wrap your head around.
The routine was unyielding. Patients were required to sit out on these open-air porches for 8 to 12 hours a day, regardless of the weather.
And we are talking about upstate New York here.
Exactly. In the Adirondacks, winter temperatures frequently drop well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit.
The memoirs describe the physical setup in detail. The nurses would wrap the patients in layers of wool sweaters, put heated soapstones at their feet.
Prevent frostbite.
Right. Cover them with massive raccoon or buffalo fur coats, and then tightly swaddle them in multiple heavy blankets. A process they actually called taking the cure. They were essentially cocooned.
Completely immobilized.
Some patients recalled waking up from naps on the porch to find a foot of snow drifted across their beds, or reaching for the glass of water on their nightstand only to find it frozen solid. And they just had to sit there, completely motionless, for hours.
Because movement was the enemy. The second pillar of Trudeau's therapy was absolute rest. If a patient had a fever, they were forbidden from walking, reading, or sometimes even talking.
Not even talking.
Not if it raised their heart rate. The goal was to reduce the metabolic demand on the body to the absolute minimum.
So I have to pause here and ask the critical question, looking back with our modern medical knowledge. Did sitting buried under a snowdrift, completely motionless for 12 hours a day, actually cure anyone of tuberculosis?
The definitive biological answer is no.
I figured.
The cold air did not kill Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The bacteria were perfectly warm and safe deep inside the host's lungs. The sanatoria did not cure the disease in a pharmacological sense at all.
So was it entirely a placebo effect then? Just suffering for the sake of feeling like you're fighting back?
No, it was deeply pragmatic, even if the mechanism wasn't perfectly understood by them at the time. What the sanatorium regimen actually achieved was optimizing the patient's immune system.
Okay, how so?
By enforcing absolute rest, you dramatically lower the heart rate and the respiratory rate. You decrease the oxygen demand on the damaged lungs, which gives the tissue a chance to heal. By force-feeding patients incredibly rich, high-calorie diets.
Oh, right, the food. Or they sometimes require them to drink 6 glasses of milk a day on top of heavy meals.
Yes. You counteract the cachexia that we talked about earlier. You give the body the fuel it needs to mount an immune response. You are essentially giving the human body the absolute best possible baseline odds to fight the infection to a standstill.
So you were trying to help the body build those tubercles, to build those walls around the bacteria and calcify them, essentially trapping the disease.
Exactly. It was biological containment. But the sanatorium served a second, arguably far more vital function from a macro public health perspective. It provided isolation.
Ah, you were removing the vector from the population.
Precisely. By taking a highly infectious patient out of a crowded, unventilated tenement in New York City and moving them to an isolated cottage on a mountain, you break the chain of transmission.
You save their family.
You prevent that individual from infecting their spouse, their children, their coworkers. The sanatorium was effectively a massive quarantine strategy masquerading as a medical retreat. While many patients did improve and achieve a state of arrested disease, allowing them to eventually return to society, a tragic number of people simply died in those beautiful freezing mountains.
And that leads into the psychological toll, which the memoirs emphasize heavily. You have to imagine the emotional reality of this suspended existence. You are abruptly severed from your family, your career, your entire identity back home.
You're just a patient now.
Right.
Yeah.
You are dropped into this highly regimented, total institution where your entire existence is reduced to monitoring your own biology. Patients obsessed over their temperature charts. Gaining a single pound was cause for major celebration, but a spike in fever of half a degree was a source of sheer terror.
They existed in a liminal space. They were removed from the world of the healthy, but they weren't entirely dead. This intense isolation forged unique, incredibly tight-knit micro-societies.
Sanatorium culture.
Yeah, Saranac Lake and other cure towns developed their own internal cultures. They had dark humor about mortality, specialized slang, and intense, heavily surveilled romances between patients.
Wait, surveilled romances?
Oh yeah, the medical staff usually tried to strictly suppress any romance to maintain the rest protocol. Strong emotions were thought to be bad for the fever.
That is wild. But reading through all this, a glaring issue becomes immediately obvious. Going to a pristine mountain retreat, having a team of nurses wrap you in buffalo fur, and being fed heavy cream and steaks while resting completely for 2 to 5 years? That is an astronomical luxury.
Oh, it was prohibitively expensive for the vast majority of the population.
Exactly. Even though Trudeau subsidized the costs for many at his original sanitarium, the reality is that the millions of working-class people, the immigrants dying in the factories and tenements, they could not afford to chase the cure in the Adirondacks.
Not a chance.
So if the sanatorium was only available to a fraction of the population, how's the United States fighting this massive nation-destroying plague on a macro level? Who was funding the fight in the cities?
This is where the story shifts dramatically from the quiet mountains back to the noisy, crowded streets. The battle against tuberculosis in the early 20th century represents one of the most profound mobilizations of civic society in history because, crucially, this was not a top-down, federally mandated or federally funded war.
The dossier highlights the National Tuberculosis Association, which was founded in 1904, We know them today as the American Lung Association.
Right.
They looked at the landscape and realized a harsh truth. Fighting a disease that thrives on poverty, overcrowding, and malnutrition requires an immense amount of money, and it requires a complete overhaul of public infrastructure.
And they knew they could not rely on the federal government to provide those funds. Public health at the federal level was simply not structured or budgeted to fight a domestic civilian epidemic of this scale back then.
So what did they do?
They had to bypass the government entirely and go directly to the populace. Which brings us to a social worker from Delaware who fundamentally revolutionized public health fundraising. A woman named Emily Bissell.
Emily Bissell's story is incredible. In 1907, Bissell had a cousin, a doctor, who was desperately trying to operate a small, bare-bones, open-air TB shack for poor patients on the Brandywine River.
And they were completely broke.
Right. They needed $300, which was a substantial sum in 1907, just to keep the facility running through the winter. Bissell had read an article by Jacob Riis about a unique program in Denmark, where the post office sold special, voluntary charity stamps during the holidays to raise money for sick children.
And she saw the potential.
She decided to adapt the idea for tuberculosis in America.
Bissell, working entirely on her own initiative, designs the very first American Christmas seal. She draws the design herself, a simple wreath, convinces a local printer to front her the cost of printing 50,000 stamps, and sets up a small table in the lobby of the local post office in Wilmington, Delaware.
And she sells them for a single penny apiece.
A single penny?
A penny. It sounds so completely insignificant when you are fighting the leading cause of death in the world.
But the psychology behind that penny was brilliant, and it pioneered modern decentralized philanthropy. Bissell understood that you cannot fund a massive public health war solely by soliciting large donations from a few wealthy philanthropists.
You need volume.
Exactly. Almost every single person, regardless of their economic class, could afford to part with 1 penny to place a colorful stamp on their holiday mail. It allowed the working class to actively participate in saving themselves. It democratized the fight.
The results were explosive. Her initial goal to save the river shack was $300. By the end of that first holiday season, she had raised over $3,000.
10 times her goal.
The very next year, the Christmas Seal campaign went national, partnering with the Red Cross and eventually the National Tuberculosis Association. That tiny 1 penny stamp became the financial bedrock of the entire American anti-TB crusade.
The revenue generated by those pennies was staggering over the ensuing decades. But we need to look at how that money was deployed, because they didn't just build more sanatoria. They deployed the funds directly into the tenements.
How so?
The Christmas Seal money paid for thousands of visiting public health nurses. These nurses walked directly into the slums, identifying sick individuals, teaching families about ventilation, demonstrating how to properly dispose of sputum, and enforcing basic hygiene protocols.
To stop the aerosolized spread of the bacillus.
Exactly.
They also funded massive public education campaigns. Our dossier has examples of these striking, highly visual posters from the era, warning about the dangers of spitting in public, the necessity of hand washing, and the vital importance of fresh air.
It was a complete cultural rewiring regarding hygiene.
But beyond education, the anti-TB movement recognized that you cannot medicate your way out of an architectural problem. This leads to the massive push for municipal housing reform.
This is a critical piece of the puzzle. The National Tuberculosis Association and allied reform groups lobbied municipal governments relentlessly to change city building codes. They understood the biology. The tuberculosis needs dark, stagnant air to thrive.
Therefore, the architecture of the city itself had to become hostile to the bacteria.
Precisely.
The New York State Tenement House Act of 1901 is a prime example of this. Reformers forced the city to outlaw the construction of any new buildings with windowless interior rooms. They legally mandated outward-facing windows for ventilation, indoor plumbing, and the inclusion of open courtyards.
To allow sunlight and fresh air to penetrate the dense city blocks.
Right. They effectively changed the physical shape of modern American cities, specifically to disrupt the aerosolized transmission of a single microbe.
It was an all-encompassing, society-wide holding action. You have grassroots charities raising millions of pennies, visiting nurses educating the working class, city planners overhauling architectural codes, and private sanatoria isolating the infected.
Okay, so we have this massive decentralized army fighting the disease. My immediate question when reviewing this timeline was, where is the federal government? If this disease is killing roughly 100,000 Americans every single year, why is the primary financial engine a charity stamp?
The limited role of the federal government is one of the most surprising aspects of this history to modern observers. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the federal health apparatus was incredibly small and operated under a very strict, historically narrow mandate.
What was the agency called back then?
The primary federal health agency was the Marine Hospital Service, which was the precursor to the modern public health service.
And I flagged this in the notes because it honestly baffled me. In 1899, the Marine Hospital Service opens the very first federal tuberculosis sanatorium at Fort Stanton, New Mexico, a massive dry air facility in the desert.
Yes.
But Fort Stanton was exclusively reserved for tubercular merchant seamen.
That is entirely correct. It was not open to the general public.
Wait, so the leading killer in the nation is hollowing out the industrial workforce in cities across the country, and the federal government's flagship institutional response is to build an isolated hospital, specifically to treat guys who work on boats.
It sounds absurd until you look at the constitutional and historical framework of the era. The Marine Hospital Service was established in 1798 with one specific goal: to provide medical care for sick and disabled sailors.
Why sailors specifically?
In order to keep the maritime shipping industry, the absolute lifeblood of the young nation's economy, functioning, the federal government believed its constitutional authority regarding health extended only to interstate commerce and maritime trade.
Oh, I see.
They did not believe they had the legal authority, nor did they have the budget, to act as a comprehensive national health provider for the general civilian population.
So public health was strictly a state, municipal, and private problem.
Mm-hmm.
The federal government is basically just acting as a supporting character.
Exactly.
They are doing some laboratory research. They are inspecting immigrants at Ellis Island. They are managing their specific slice of the population, the sailors and the military. But they are entirely outsourcing the heavy lifting of fighting the nation's biggest killer to the charities, the local governments, and the citizens buying Christmas seals.
Precisely. The federal government would not truly take a leading central role in funding civilian public health and disease eradication until the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II.
Which is a massive paradigm shift later on.
For sure. For the entire first half of the century, the war against the White Plague was fought by the populace itself. But, while the penny stamps, the housing codes, and the freezing porches of the sanatoria were successfully holding the line and slowly driving down the mortality rate, they were not a cure.
Right, they were just stalling.
The killing blow against Robert Koch's germ was never going to come from a policy change or a mountain breeze.
No. To finally end the 60-year nightmare, science had to find a weapon. And that weapon wasn't discovered in a massive federal laboratory or a pristine hospital. It was pulled directly out of the dirt on an academic campus in New Jersey.
We are shifting the timeline now to 1943. The world is consumed by the Second World War. But on the agricultural campus of Rutgers University, an entirely different, incredibly consequential battle is taking place in a soil microbiology lab.
I find this scientific pivot absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
The team is led by a towering figure in microbiology named Waksman. And his team includes these brilliant researchers, notably a young graduate student named Albert Schatz and a researcher named Elizabeth Buggy.
Right.
Now, to the layperson, the idea of looking at literal farm dirt to cure a devastating human lung disease seems totally counterintuitive. Why the soil?
It is brilliant lateral thinking based on ecological principles. Waksman spent decades studying the complex, invisible ecosystems of microbes that live in the earth. Specifically, he focused on a group of bacteria called actinomyces.
Okay, actinomyces.
Waksman recognized a fundamental truth about nature. The soil is a microscopic battlefield. Bacteria and fungi are in a constant, relentless war for limited resources and nutrients.
So the evolutionary logic is that over millions of years of fighting in the dirt, these microbes must have developed chemical weapons to kill their competitors.
Exactly. If one soil bacterium produces a toxic chemical that kills off a competing colony, it secures the resources for itself. Waksman hypothesized that if we could meticulously screen the soil, isolate these natural chemical weapons and extract them, we might find one that is toxic to Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but relatively safe for humans.
And he had a name for these weapons, didn't he?
He did. He coined a new term for these extracted chemical weapons.
Antibiotics.
Antibiotics. So they essentially start digging. But it's not a shot in the dark. It's a massive, systematic screening process. They test roughly 10,000 different strains of soil microbes over several years.
It was exhausting bench work. And I want to quickly pause here to provide some context on another medical development because listeners who know the history of TB might be asking, wait, Why were they so desperately searching for a cure in the soil in 1943? Wasn't there already a vaccine?
That is a crucial piece of context. Yes, the BCG vaccine. It was developed in France by Albert Calmette and Camille Guérin and was actually introduced globally around 1921. It's still used in many parts of the world today. But the United States largely rejected the widespread use of the BCG vaccine.
Why? If you have a vaccine that can prevent the biggest killer of the century, why on earth would the U.S. public health establishment refuse to deploy it?
It came down to a heated debate over public health strategy and the variable nature of the vaccine itself. First, the BCG vaccine's efficacy was notoriously inconsistent. In some trials, it offered robust protection. In others, almost none at all.
Okay, that's a problem.
But the primary reason the U.S. rejected it was logistical. By the 1930s and 40s, the U.S. had heavily invested in a strategy of mass surveillance using the tuberculin skin test.
Right, this is the test where they inject a tiny protein under the skin of your arm to see if a red bump forms, indicating you've been exposed to TB.
Correct. The skin test doesn't just detect active contagious tuberculosis, it detects immune memory. It detects antibodies. If the U.S. public health system suddenly vaccinated the entire population with BCG, every single person would test positive on the skin test forever.
Because the vaccine stimulates those exact same antibodies.
So mass vaccination would completely blind the surveillance system. They wouldn't be able to use the skin test to track actual active outbreaks or isolate infectious individuals.
Exactly. The U.S. prioritized their ability to trace and isolate over a vaccine of questionable efficacy. Because of that strategic choice, the American population remained highly vulnerable. They absolutely desperately needed a therapeutic drug cure, which makes the work happening in Waksman's Rutgers lab so critical.
And the breakthrough finally happens. In 1943, Albert Schatz, the young graduate student who was working day and night in a basement lab, dealing with incredibly dangerous, highly infectious strains of the TB bacteria, hits the jackpot. He really did.
From a heavily manured patch of soil, they isolate a strain of streptomyces griseus. And the chemical weapon it produces is a compound they named streptomycin.
Streptomycin is the magic bullet the world had been waiting 60 years for. When Schatz tested the extracted streptomycin against Mycobacterium tuberculosis in the lab, it didn't just suppress the bacteria's growth, it annihilated it.
Do we know the specific mechanism? Like, how did this chemical from the dirt actually kill the armored bug that Koch discovered?
It operates on a beautifully specific biochemical level. Streptomycin is an aminoglycoside antibiotic. It penetrates the bacterial cell wall and binds directly to the 30S subunit of the bacterial ribosome.
The ribosome.
The ribosome is the cellular machinery that translates messenger RNA into the proteins the bacteria needs to survive and replicate. By binding to that subunit, streptomycin causes the ribosome to misread the genetic code.
So it's like throwing a massive wrench into the bacteria's 3D printer. The bacteria starts assembling malformed, useless proteins, and its entire cellular structure just collapses.
A perfect analogy. It completely halts bacterial protein synthesis, leading to cell death. And crucially, human ribosomes have a different structure, so the drug targets the bacteria without immediately killing the human host. Though it did have significant side effects, particularly regarding hearing loss, which had to be carefully managed.
The impact of this discovery is almost impossible to overstate. They move rapidly from the lab to animal trials, and by 1944, they are conducting human trials. Patients who are literally on their deathbeds, suffering from forms of TB that were considered 100% fatal, are given streptomycin and they recover.
It was miraculous.
After decades of freezing porches, radical surgeries, and penny stamps, humanity finally held the weapon. It is an unparalleled triumph of American academic science.
It is a towering achievement that saved millions of lives. But, this raises an important question. As we analyze the history of science, we have to look at the human element. And the aftermath of the discovery of streptomycin reveals a deeply messy, incredibly dark side of academic research.
Yeah, this was not a clean narrative where noble scientists link arms and celebrate their gift to humanity.
No, it is a story of profound ego, betrayal, and a bitter fight for legacy and money. Because the question immediately arose, who actually gets the credit for this miracle?
Right.
Selman Waksman, as the head of the laboratory and the architect of the soil screening methodology, claimed the absolute lion's share of the glory. He marginalized the contributions of his team, and in 1952, Waksman alone was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of streptomycin.
Which completely erased Albert Schatz, The graduate student who physically isolated the specific organism, who ran the dangerous assays, and who first documented the drug's efficacy against the tubercle bacillus.
Exactly. Furthermore, Waksman had privately arranged with the Rutgers Research and Endowment Foundation to receive a significant percentage of the patent royalties for streptomycin.
Oh, wow.
Which quickly amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars, a staggering fortune at the time.
And Schatz, the guy who did the actual bench work, was getting nothing.
Schatz was initially told that the patent would be held by the university for the public good, with no one personally profiting. When he discovered Waksman's secret royalty arrangement, Schatz felt profoundly betrayed.
I mean, naturally.
In 1950, in a move that absolutely shocked the conservative, hierarchical world of mid-century academia, Albert Schatz sued his own mentor. He sued Summon Waksman and the Rutgers Foundation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. A graduate student suing a titan of science over the biggest medical discovery of the decade. This scandal must have been immense.
Oh, it was incredibly bitter. Schatz sued for legal recognition as a co-discoverer and for a fair share of the royalties. The scientific establishment largely turned against Schatz, viewing his lawsuit as an unforgivable breach of academic decorum.
Closing ranks.
Exactly. The pressure was immense, but ultimately Rutgers and Waksman settled out of court. Schatz was legally granted the title of co-discoverer and was awarded a portion of the royalties.
But the personal damage was already done. From the sources, it seems Waksman never forgave him, and Schatz's career in mainstream American academia was essentially derailed. He spent years working in relative obscurity or abroad.
Yeah, it's a sad footnote to a massive victory.
It is such a stark, relentlessly human juxtaposition. In one hand, you have this godlike achievement, a compound pulled from the dirt that empties out the sanatoria and ends a 60-year plague. In the other hand, you have lawsuits, bruised egos, and men tearing each other apart over whose name goes on the plaque and who gets the royalty check. We can cure the incurable, but we can't escape our own nature.
It is a complex legacy, for sure. But regardless of the tragic drama in the laboratory, the physical impact of streptomycin on the world was absolute and immediate. The drug, along with other subsequent antibiotics like isoniazid and PAS developed shortly after, completely restructured the medical landscape.
The aftermath is breathtaking in its speed. Throughout the 1950s, tuberculosis abruptly transitioned from a life-consuming disease that required years of absolute isolation in a mountain hospital to an outpatient illness. You could be cured with a long course of prescription pills taken in your own home.
And because of that pharmacological victory, the massive society-wide infrastructure that had been painstakingly built over half a century simply became obsolete.
Just overnight.
The great sanatoria, including Trudeau's pioneering Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium at Saranac Lake, rapidly emptied out. The long, open-air cure porches where tens of thousands of people had spent years wrapped in fur chasing the cure were suddenly quiet. The institutions either closed their doors forever, went bankrupt, or were repurposed into prisons, state offices, or general hospitals. The era of the sanatorium was officially over.
As we step back and synthesize this massive journey we've just taken through the dossier, the overarching arc is incredibly profound. When you look at how the White Plague was ultimately beaten back, the central lesson is not that a massive centralized government agency swooped in and saved the day.
No, not at all. The mechanism of victory was a staggering, decentralized coalition. It required the whole of society operating on multiple fronts. It required Edward Trudeau and the patients enduring the psychological and physical trial of the sanatoria to isolate the contagion.
It required Emily Bissell and millions of working-class citizens funding nurses 1 penny at a time.
Right. It required urban planners fighting for sunlight in the slums. And finally, it required academic researchers systematically digging through the soil. It was a distributed war of attrition.
And I think it's vital to connect this history directly back to you listening to this right now. Because tuberculosis was so completely pervasive, if you trace your own family tree back just a few generations into the 19th or early 20th century, you're almost guaranteed to find the shadow of the White Plague.
Statistically, yes.
You likely have an ancestor who endured the freezing porches of a sanatorium, or a great-aunt who bought sheets of Christmas seals, or a great-grandparent whose life was quietly cut short before streptomycin was found. This isn't just distant medical history. This is the literal family history of almost everyone.
And it is the foundational bedrock of our modern public health infrastructure. We learned how to organize civic campaigns, how to democratize medical fundraising, and how to utilize municipal law to protect public health, all through the agonizing crucible of tuberculosis.
Which leaves me with a final, lingering thought for you to mull over today. We currently live in an era of unprecedented medical expectation. If a novel pathogen appears, our immediate cultural assumption is that a massive pharmaceutical company or a government agency will sequence its genome in a week and hand us a pill or a vaccine within a few months. And miraculously, they often do.
Usually, yes.
But what if that system fails? If we were suddenly faced with a slow, grinding, decades-long biological crisis that modern science simply could not instantly solve, do we still possess that specific civic capacity? Do we still have the community-level willpower to mobilize, to radically alter our cities, to fund the fight penny by penny, and to hold the line together for 60 agonizing years, just like those people sitting perfectly still beneath the snowdrifts on those Adirondack porches did?